Hello and welcome back to the Dueling Grounds podcast. Today I have a very special guest, Felix from Bitzelberg. If you haven't somehow heard of Bitzelberg, they're a channel significantly bigger than we are, and they are the reason that our channel exists. Our game shop was struggling with FNMs, modern, standard, pioneer, nothing was firing, and Adam stumbled across Bitzelberg on YouTube. We decided to try Duel Commander because it would maybe appeal to some more casual people, being a commander-related format, and it went perfectly. And we're really happy with how it's going. So thank you so much, Felix, for all the work you do in the community. It's a pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you very much. Kind words for the introduction. Happy to be here and happy to hear that we kind of inspired the British community to try out this nice singleton format, I would say.
Yeah, it's a really, really good format. And so this video we're doing today, we're going to be talking about how do you evaluate cards for Duel Commander. Obviously, every format's different, so evaluating cards in any format is all very format dependent because of stuff like metagames. I think Duel Commander has a very unique angle, that being that it has a command zone. So obviously, how does the command zone impact card evaluation? Is something we're talking about. And as you suggested, we're going to be talking a little bit about the history of card evaluation through Duel Commander and how that's changed from when the format started to today.
Yeah, exactly. I have to say I'm not part of the format since the very beginning. I think it started somewhere in 2009, 2010, 11. I'm not exactly sure, to be honest. But back then when I started, which was like 10 years ago, roughly, it was still at 30 HP, we have to say that. And people were actually playing things like Grand Arbiter in the command zone, Maelstrom Wanderer. Very back then, I didn't start then, but it was Oloro, for example, I think because we had a chat up front, and I think what was more important was you had this format of Duel Commander. You were suddenly thrown out of this 4-player pot into a 1v1 situation, and you were rather thinking about, okay, now I have to somewhat go competitive, and legendary creatures back then were designed more for the lore instead of being super crazy cards like they are today, to be honest. So you were searching for some of those legendary creatures that you could actually have a build around, such as Grand Arbiter, because Grand Arbiter back then, especially in 30 HP, in the 30 HP environment, you had very costly spells. The metagame or Magic overall was much slower, so spells would cost much more mana, and then having like a tempo advantage by decreasing your spell's cost was actually very beneficial. And that's why people, for example, went with that. I don't have all the different cards up in my mind that were played back then, but if you have a look at yourself or for yourself at MTG Top 8, you will see that the commanders were totally crazy. And that's, by the way, also a reason why cards like Zergo that appeared in Takis Khans, no, how was the set called? Yeah, something like this, right? Takia. Were absolutely crazy because all of a sudden you have a 1-mana command zone competing with a 4, 5, 6-mana command zone. Or also was that the reason that the Edgar Markov, the Eminem's ability that was printed with Arabo and Edgar and Inala, was suddenly super, super interesting because it gave you an advantage out of the command zone without casting the command zone that was otherwise super expensive to play. Yeah, if we have a look at the cards today, it's completely different, right? Things have changed so much. There was a time, remind me, for how long do you play Duel Commander now?
So,
for about a year?
Just like a year and 2 months, I think, is the answer.
Okay. Because there was a time back then, I think it was when Magic or Wizards actually started with these Commander precon sets and stuff, and then there was Kess, for example. 4 mana, 3/4. There was an era in which people actually looked at the stats first in comparison to the mana value. We still do this, but back then it was super important, with Red Deck Wins being one of the most omnipresent decks ever. So it was super important that your commander does not die to a bolt, because paying 4 mana to trade for 1 mana is certainly very bad. And Kess was, for example, for a very long time a leader of the Grixis control shell, because it has had the resilience, or still has, and you also had the time to establish your entire game plan, like getting things in your graveyard, everything. As I said, everything was much slower, and then all of a sudden it slowly developed towards this fire concept, where things like Fatal Push were suddenly printed, and we got Scavenging Oozes and all that stuff, like more abilities packed into lower mana costs. And that also affected the command zones very much, I would say. And yeah, if we have a look at today's meta game, look at all the cards. Felia, Spider-Man, Aragon, whatsoever. Basically, all of those cards are either super cheap to cast, or most of the time they will have an immediate effect with which they impact the board, actually.
So cards like Pyroglyph, where they
I
enter,
think-
they kill a creature, and then it also sticks around and it's a big body.
Exactly. It's not only for the command zone, but as definitely also for the 99, that most of those cards have to have an immediate effect. Or if you still play a synergistic command zone, then the synergy has to be extremely strong. For example, just out of my mind, if you play Marav, most of those lists will play Conclave Mentor, because it doubles the amount of counters that you put onto permanents. Or actually it adds one counter for each counter, but it's basically the same, right? So things like this are definitely, it definitely changed in a way that you just have to do something immediately. You cannot wait for 1 or 2 turns in order to get together some synergies and hope for things working out, and looking at 2 or 3 cards that need to be combined in order for this one card with a very powerful, unique effect to be useful. That doesn't work anymore. Even if you look at the combo decks, I mean, Nadu is banned now, but if we have a look at the Thrasios Tymna lists, they're completely tuned towards efficiency. Like almost all the slots, even Nadu itself, outside of the combo, is a useful card. Or it was a useful card, right? And Devoted Druid itself is probably, I would say, the only card that is the weakest in terms of what it brings to the board, but it still produces mana. It still produces mana. And these days, if it dies, it's not that bad, because the squirrel is waiting around the corner, trying to eat it from the graveyard. And then again, you have established another loop. So it's crazy how it developed. Because the more I talk about it right now, the more I think how we played Magic back then. I was playing Leovold for a very long time because I enjoyed that. Also, one of these cards, 3 mana, 3/3, has a static effect that is sometimes very useful against some strategies, and you also have some combo cards. But for example, Alexandre Habert, I think, he played it for a couple of times. And today you play Days Undoing, and how's the other card called? Diminished Returns. Is it Diminished Returns? You know what I'm talking about?
Returns, it's in Dan.
Yeah, exactly. It's a 4 mana Eternal Masters whatsoever. It comes from another set, but okay. And back then you were playing much more synergistic cards, like Teferi's Puzzle Box. How's the 2 mana thing called? Bogadan. A card that lets both players draw a card in the upkeep, I think, or an additional card in the draw step.
Howling Mine?
And then you have to discard something.
Oh, no.
No, it's not Howling Mine. How can I forget? People will tell in the comments. It's actually, or we will look it up afterwards. Things like this, people were much more focused on searching for a legendary creature that has like a synergistic but yet powerful effect, and then try to build some synergies around that. And slowly but surely, this mid-rangey card pool was more and more integrated into all those decks. I remember when we tried to record videos 3 years ago with some fancy command zones that had that also had some synergistic effects, we often ended up with tier 3 at best piles. These days, you can just put any command zone at the helm of a deck, and you can just fill the 99 with good stuff. And most of the time, you might win a game because your 99 carries the game. Because, it doesn't matter if you play the new Merfolk Zig as your Azorius commander, or Aang, or, I don't know, Danik, whatsoever. Of course, it does matter, because the command zone is also a big part of your performance. But, in regards to the 99 is almost always the same. There are some nuances here and there. Obviously, if you play Plagon, then you will have more creatures with toughness higher than power and stuff like this. But you get my point, right?
Yeah, I completely understand. Most decks that are in the same color combinations are running a very large percentage of the same cards. The only exceptions would be sometimes there's archetypal shifts. When you're looking at Jund at the moment, we've got obviously Slimefoot and Squee, but then you've got Rograk. So because obviously they're completely different archetypes, they have a much different card pool. It's interesting here you talk about the history of the format as well. Someone who hasn't been there, you say cards like Grand Arbiter, Augustin used to be like a playable card, and I look at it, I'm like, but it does nothing. It doesn't fly in today's
That's
Magic.
true. It does nothing on its own. Yeah, that's right. You have to take in consideration, or you have to actually keep in mind that the 30 HP metagame was very different from the 20 HP metagame, because the original idea was to bring back the aggressive decks, like Zergo, for example. Zergo was really flourishing in 20 HP meta because, as I said, people were still sticking to very high CMC command zones, while you just came in with your safe turn 1 drop all the time. And people suddenly needed to adjust to that, in terms of... And back then, the removal suit was not really as good as it is today. Of course, you had Swords to Plowshares and a couple of one-drop things, but not in comparison to today. Like, today, it's just so much
I think
faster.
when you're talking about removal here, I think that's a really key thing to hone in on. And that's one of the reasons why command zones have to be so much more powerful and why you have to be doing something immediately, right? You used to be able to play a 4-drop card where you had to wait because the removal wasn't as good as it is today. Nowadays, your commander has to do something as it enters because it's probably going to die. And if it doesn't die, that's great.
Absolutely.
But you need to be impacting the board before your commander dies.
Yeah, definitely. And we picked a couple of examples for that, right? From the recent Lovin set, actually, just to have something to talk about. So I remember when Ashling was spoiled, I think we talked about it shortly. And Samuel was, by the way, also really hyped about the card. And I think you were also hyped about it. At least I saw that in the international Discord. You talked about it with some other players. And now you said you tinkered a bit with the deck and it doesn't really come together.
I think, yeah, 100%. So I'm only playing for about a year, as you said, and I still see too much upside in the cards. I don't necessarily look at the reality. Ashling excites me a lot. I think it's a really fun card, and I think like for casual commander, it's maybe a deck I'd like to visit for that format. But in reality, having played the deck a bit, yes, sometimes it has these really swingy, really powerful turns, but those aren't common occurrences. Most of the time, as you've said, you'll play it on turn 3 and then you pass and it dies, and you don't get to do the evoke 4. Because you play it on 3, it looks like it lines up really well. You play it on turn 3, turn 4 you get to evoke in something massive, get the ETB twice and swing with something massive. But unless you've got a card that cheats its casting cost, so you can evoke it the turn you play it, or one of the MH elementals, the reality is most of the time it's going to die before it gets to do anything.
Do you think that's because of the way the card is designed? So we just talked about that earlier. We have the power and toughness that are very essential for a card to be evaluated. Then we have the mana value, obviously. And then in comparison to, the overall game plan, like, what is the strategy? Which archetype does this card fit into? What is this trying to do? Or what is it trying to win with, actually? And if we look at this card, 3 mana, I talked about this, okay, it should not be bolted. I wouldn't say that's too relevant these days. Then again, I would have said that 3 months ago, to be honest. Nowadays, with all these Spider-Mans running around, it's very relevant again, because we don't only have to face Lightning Bolt, we have to face Galvanic Discharge and the Fiery Impulse and Chain Lightning and whatsoever, So the 3 toughness is already okay. Then does it do something the turn it comes into play? Not really, unless you have one of those powerful evoke elementals. And is the turn after good enough for this creature to be worth your commander and to go into this entire deck building process and stuff? Because deck building is another aspect here, which can be quite tricky, because you want to play like those interesting payoffs, like the high CMC payoffs that have like very good effects. We talked about the Maelstrom Wanderer, for example. You want to evoke something like this for 4, definitely. Then there is the Tumbleweed, right? Is it called
Tumbleweed's
like this?
a fun card, yeah. It costs 1 less for each land in the graveyard, so you can, in theory, play it. You can't play it on turn 3. Also, there's not really any benefit to doing it on turn 3 because you're not going to have 4 lands in the graveyard, and also it doesn't give haste to your other creatures. But later on in the game, like turn 4, it's an amazing turn 4 play. I think the most powerful elemental I found was the Sunderflock, which is
I don't know
it's
this
9
one.
mana and it costs X less, where X is the CMC, the greater CMC among other elementals you control, and it bounces all non-elementals. So with Ashling, it evokes for 1 mana if you just have Ashling in play. And in most of my test games, it was one of the cards I tutored for the most, because the ability to just go 1 mana, bounce your opponent's entire board, and then swing in for 5 was pretty strong.
Yeah, I can imagine that. But it sounds a bit like more like these interactions that you bring up in the multiplayer game. Like, oh yeah, and if this goes right and that goes right, and then I have this card, because it's not only a matter of how consistent do I have these big targets in the big threats in my hand, but it's also because if you cannot enable them consistently, then you have to think about ways to get them into your hand all over again, which in our format means Worldly Tutor and Demonic Tutor, basically, right? So there's not that big of a tutor suit in order to search for those big boys reliably. Yeah, I'm I'm just trying to generalize that a little bit into into a guideline for how to choose your next command zone, or rather how to evaluate the next legendary card that is thrown at your face. We have seen some cards from the Ninja Turtle set, for example.
To quickly chime in, I think it's one of those things where sometimes Duel Commander enables you to play like bad cards in your deck because they're good with the commander. And like, let's think about Spider-Man 29, which is kind of one of the best decks at the moment. Wild Ride and Reckless Charge are just bad cards. Like, they're not cards you'd almost ever want to include, but they synergize so well with Spider-Man. But they don't take up.
You've never played Dargo, did you?
No, I have. Oh, you thought the cost to sacrifice one? Yes, okay, I can see how they'd be good in that deck. But
exactly.
Generally speaking, they don't really have a home in most red decks. But Spider-Man doesn't require you to play a lot of these cards. You've got those two, and you can justify it because they win the game if they're resolved. Whereas I feel like Ashling, you're having to dedicate too much of your deck to playing bad elementals that are good with Ashling, and I think the payoff isn't high enough. On the other end, you've got a deck like Lightpaws, which does require you to play a lot of these like bad enchantments, but the payoff for Lightpaws is definitely high enough. It justifies itself.
Absolutely. Especially because, and Lightpaws is also a very interesting example because it's definitely one of those decks that developed over the time. Because I think when the card was printed, the deck was already good, but what it really needs is all these flash CMC1 auras in order to search for the right protection at the right time. And when we had the Neo set 3 or 4 years ago, something like this, right? Back then when Lightpaws was here, this was definitely not the case. With more standard sets, they printed more of these flashy 1-drop auras. That also, and then there also was from Duskmourn, I think it was I don't know the exact name, but the one that grants you hexproof until end of turn.
Rescue.
Exactly, Shard Mage's Rescue, yeah. And now, very, very new inclusion are the Brilliant Wings.
They are brilliant.
Which also they are indeed brilliant. I think if we are at a point at which they have a 1 mana aura that grants that effect, even if it's just, let's say, spoken in Lightpaws terms, it has the same condition as a Daybreak Coronet, for example. You have to have another aura attached, which is not a downside for Lightpaws at all, and then the creature would be granted hexproof for 1 mana. I think at that point, the deck is ban-worthy, because whenever, there is almost nothing that can destroy this card. Because you have Totem Armor from Dog Umbra and Hyena Umbra, which circumvents all the destroy effects, and then you have protection from all the colors, and then it's probably Otawara Bounce, Talon Gates, Face Outs, things like this, because it's hard to grant protection from colorless. But it's like it was a process within those years. We had to develop towards a command zone that is as solid as it is today. That's sometimes the case with command zones that, the card is printed and you think, it looks interesting. You bring together your 100 cards and you feel like, I don't know, maybe 5 cards are missing in order to really make a good deck out of it. And then you give it some time and Wizards all of a sudden printing the right cards and stuff. But maybe let's get back to evaluating the cards again. I'm trying to think of another good example. You talked about Slamfoot, right? Let's talk about Adjunct Commander, the Reaper King. We're back to Lorwyn. So when the card was spoiled, people were kind of hyped about it. We both talked about it too. I was personally not really hyped about it. We also didn't mention it in our review. I think it's an interesting one, and I see people brew with it, but it's a very specific card. And when a new card for a specific color combination is printed, people will automatically always compare it to the function and the performance of the current and existing color combination that's here. When was the last time that happened? For example, the Sonic Hedgehog was printed for Mana Jeskai Commander. People were immediately, okay, that's somewhat a worse Zatya or Aragon. Why would I play that? That's it. Discussion ended. Now with the Reaper King, of course, we have one giant commander that's very popular. It's Slamfoot. This is more of a specific card, I would say, because it interacts with the 1/1 counters, and then you bring back cards if they died due to the counters and stuff. If you look at the cards, in a vacuum, 3 mana, 3/3, same as Slamfoot, doesn't add something to the board if it isn't for the right archetype your opponent plays. If you play this into an aggressive deck, really good, I would say. You reduce the size of a Yoshimaru and stuff like this. Maybe Yoshi is not the best example because the counters negate themselves, but let's say Zergo, just for an example, And then later on, you might make use of the second triggered ability. That's brilliant. Let's say you play this against Aragon. Aragon can or cannot provide a creature early on, but depending on the hand, you can also just play more like a control game and not provide any creature, and maybe even intentionally not providing a creature, because if you don't bring anything to the board and you just paid 3 mana in order to play your commander, but the first trigger doesn't happen, you pay 3 mana for nothing, more or less. Because if you don't have any secondary effects in your 99 that would put -1/-1 counter onto creatures, you can't make use of the last effect either. So they can just stall and force you to play with your 99 and delay the cast of your commander. And if you play this into control, it's even worse. If you play this into Tivit or into Atraxa, you might be lucky and curve it into Psychic Frog, for example. That's randomly put on the field, or a Barrowgolf. But it's very unlikely that against a control deck you will ever get to make use of the synergy that the Reaper King brings.
And it doesn't work well with Frog either, because they can just discard a card, put a +1/+1 counter on it to negate the -1/-1 counter.
Right. Bad example in terms of the Psychic Frog. Yeah. You're right. It was the first card that came to my mind when I thought about the control deck. But yeah, so this is actually how I would think about this card. And then if you already have from 3, we don't have to talk about combo, because this card just instantly folds to combo. It has probably nothing to do against Storm, and maybe it's also the case for Leer, Tifa, Lightpulse, things like this. Not really anything to offer against that, unless you squeeze the mid-range card pool into the 99. And then again, if you do that to a certain percentage, let's say 90% Slimefoot includes are in your Reaper King, then you have to ask yourself, well, why would I not just play Slimefoot instead? And that's my thought process on this card.
I mean, the angle that I've seen that is justification that the Reaper King provides is that I've seen lists that are less focused on the -1/-1 counters and are focused more on the fact that he's a 6-drop that you play for free. So there's the good synergy with like Eldritch Evolution, a Birthing Pod, where you can turn it into a 7-drop and 8-drop from your deck. So
that's a fair consideration. Yeah. The question is, well, it does not pot into a Archon, for example, but there might be some Simsy 7 drops that are. This guy has total Simsy 6, right?
Yeah, 6, yeah. So Eldritch Evolution does get you Archon. I've seen also people.
That's true.
It's running like a Hoarding Broodlord line, because you can get Eldritch Evolution into Broodlord, and then you get your combo there.
Then again, we're in Jund colors. How reliable can you get either Birthing Pod or Eldritch Evolution? 2 out of 100, like maybe you have a couple of tutor effects to get that going. And then you need to compensate for the 9 out of 10 games in which you don't see either of those cards. And then you have to ask yourself again, is it worth it? And does it really do the job better than Slimefoot does? Do you have another example of like maybe a mono-colored commander, for example, or any other card, because I think it's best to explain our thoughts if we have.
So talking about the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles set that's coming out soon.
Oh yeah,
there's a card called, I think it's called Krang. It's got affinity for artifacts. Krang Mastermind.
Oh yeah, Mastermind. Yes. Yeah, that's a really spicy card actually. Yeah, let's talk about this. This is a good idea. Affinity is a very special archetype, I think, with a very interesting history in Duel Commander also. If you look back, we had very, very powerful affinity commanders. The first I've noticed, or I've actually faced, was back then. Incredibly powerful cards. We all know that. Then there was Emery, also very, very good deck. We have to be fair. Back then, Affinity had much more, or many more tools available. There was, I think Chromox was banned already, but we had Mox Opal, we had Mox Ember, we had Lotus Petal, things like this. All adds to the game plan. Nonetheless, really, really good decks and very solid, fast game plans. I would say back then, definitely ahead of what was possible back then, I'm not too sure if, for example, Emery would be as crazy as it was back then, especially because Lotus Petal is banned and Lion's Eye Diamonds is also banned. So it's probably harder to cheat on mana, for example. I'm pretty sure there are new lines to find, but then the good ones were gone, and then we had a very long era of Sai. going for the grindy affinity game plan, skull clamping your top the tokens, countering the things that your opponent brings down. Then we had Reality Chip, which was a very cool card. I enjoyed it a lot. And then I think for the last 2 or 3 years, maybe the viewers might disagree. Maybe I forgot about the card, but I think Affinity was kind of going in the background, because the command zones were not really fitting, too cute, not really doing anything. Also, the Affinity ability itself was not really supported that much. Maybe you could say Flame War is some kind of an affinity deck, then not really. I think Oswald was maybe the most artifact-based deck we had within the last 2 years. Maybe as I said, maybe I forgot something. But yeah, let's have a look at Krang. We have a 1/4 for 8 mana, but it has cost reduction. And the ETB says whenever you have fewer than 4 cards in hand, you draw cards equal to the difference. And this guy gets +1/+0 for each artifact you control. So 8 mana seems way too much at first, but let's have a look at the deck building. You probably try to include all those 0 mana, 1 mana artifacts that don't have the craziest effects, but, can be used for something. I think the best cards that we're thinking of are the Baubles and Welding Jar and things like this. And then there are a couple of these 0 mana equipments or the Mana's Everflowing Challenge and stuff like this. Sometimes does something, sometimes not. It's just here for the type. But your commander actually compensates for that. So you can play all these trashy artifacts, dump your commander on turn 2, refill your hand. What's the problem with that? Problem is you've actively decided to fill your 99 with lots of trashy cards just in order to bring him out as fast as possible. Nonetheless, I think I haven't done the Scryfall myself, but I think this card has potential, and maybe you find like a very balanced line. Maybe it's okay to cast this guy on turn 3 most of the time. Maybe you want some. Oh, actually, I was wrong. Lady Octopus was the latest
that's
blue
true. Yes.
affinity pile we had, right? Right. That was actually also an interesting card because people thought it would be absolutely crazy to cast your spells for free, but the commander itself didn't do anything. So you were completely reliant on your 99, which turned out to be not the best.
I was
game
also
plan
really
overall.
hyped for Lady Octopus when it was spoiled, and
Me
when
too.
I'm playing with it, it was like it just felt really clunky. It died too easily. If I was spending the slots trying to protect it, then I wasn't really advancing my game plan. I was just trying to keep Lady Octopus alive. Krang is, I think, a bit more exciting because Krang isn't just like value; it's also like it's got a win condition attached. Because that last ability, that pump can be massive.
Absolutely. What I like about this card design is it probably does not die to many CMC1 removal spells. So we have 4 toughness. Now again, in this Dice to Bolt universe, we have that checked. It will not die to Fatal Push or the new Hex or, early things that care about CMC or Power Toughness combination. This will very likely not die to a cut down.
Yes.
Because you won't cast this guy for 8 without any other artifacts on board. And it also doesn't die to Abrupt Decay or Long Goodbye and things like this. So that's definitely a benefit here. As I said, so if we not talk about the deck itself and how it might be built, looking at the commander, there is big potential, I think. It's also not that it could also cost 5 and 3 blue, which would mean that you have to pay at least 3 mana for it. Would make it much worse, I guess, because it takes off the pace that you can actually bring to the board by casting this guy so early. But this is one of those cards. We look at the CMC. CMC is high, but can be reduced. It fits the game plan, check. We have a good power and toughness ratio, check. We have a refill for playing all the trashy cards, check. And the body grows by playing more artifacts. Perfect condition, right? What else is there? Now, let's just have a look at Lady Octopus again. It's actually a very step back instead of forward. Whenever people read like abilities in combination with affinity, they're mostly or having artifact decks in mind. Mono brown, as they say. They're very hyped about that. But if you look at that card, you play for 1 mana. In the first turn, you can play your 0/2 that doesn't do anything. Then you have to have draw steps in order to put counters on it. And then you tap her to cast your cards for free, which means it needs setup. The body is super fragile. It dies to a shock. Holy Heat, whatsoever. It definitely dies to cut down. You need at least one draw step or a brainstorm or anything like this. But then again, if you manage to put the counters on this onto this permanent within the same turn, you still have, or she still has summoning sickness, so you have to wait another turn unless you have lightning grease or something. And then next turn you get to use the effect once, which can be incredibly powerful, but it can also sometimes be mediocre. I don't know, my goldfish hands I had from time to time was like, sometimes it was super good, and sometimes it was just, yeah, okay, cool, I can play my Nettle Cyst for free turn 3, cool.
And also, like,
and I can play something else, you know?
when Lady Octopus dies, all the counters are lost. Whereas with Krang, there's almost like when Krang dies and you replay it, you get to draw refill your hand again. So it definitely feels like a much better card to come down.
Yeah.
And unlike Lady Octopus, where all those counters are lost, when Krang comes back down, he still has that power buff because all those artifacts you had are still in play.
Yeah, absolutely.
The more we talk about it, the more excited I am for this card.
Yeah, I think it has potential as a commander itself. Also in the 99, a friend of mine is currently playing a lot his own brew Breya Affinity, actually, and leaning into all these artifacts that the 4 different colors have to offer. And it's actually quite a decent game plan. The new one from Mutant, how's the set called? Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, this way. It looks like it also fits into the 99. Really cool. Another card, if we stick to the Affinity plan, and we stick to CMC8 commanders with Affinity, let's have a look at Imskir, maybe. That was a card that both Samuel and me were quite hyped about, because, it was the same procedure. Well, we have a big boy with high CMC, but can be reduced due to playing artifacts. We have an ETB that redraws cards, and we have an activated ability that would convert useless artifacts into damage, right? While having a big body on board. So in theory, this card looks good. But then again, if you have a look at the 99, at least back then, maybe the card pool, I would say the card pool definitely developed a bit towards playing Imskir again, because especially red, I think the red artifact suit was very much improved over the past year or 2 years even. Cory Steel card, chainsaw, things like this, Back then, we put the deck together, didn't feel too good, to be honest. It was like, okay, you can't consistently cast this guy on turn 3. Felt a bit awkward. You need too much setup. Despite having all these cool cards, the refurbished Familiar and things like this, or the Ethereum Terramanda and all these cool cards, really cool cards, didn't feel like, I don't know. Maybe these days I would revisit the card, because in comparison to the blue guy, this card is very similar, actually. And you would think, okay, we can try to make this work, right?
I mean, we have a player at our local game shop who actually is an Imskir main. It's probably his favorite deck. He's constantly trying to make it work. And I think there is a couple of spicy cards for the 99 of Imskir that I spotted looking through all the TMNT spoilers. I can't remember the name of it, but there's a 2-mana artifact that has, whenever you cast an artifact, create a 1/1 artifact token, which again, this deck just really likes to have like a high density of those. I mean, he's playing the weapons.
You get the mutant, munition token, munition.
And those just really help to get your affinity up. I feel like, personally, I like what Krang is doing more. I think that the bottom abilities on both cards, Krang getting the buff for all your artifacts, whereas Imskir throws artifacts. Imskir works really well with cards like what they call the near enforcers and those kind of cards with affinity for artifacts. Whereas there's less of those in your deck, whereas Krang just cares about you having lots of artifacts in play. And also, no, I was about to say Krang has evasion, but Krang doesn't have evasion. So I guess he's harder to get through with. Awkward.
Yeah, I think unless you find your Shadow Spear, it will be hard in some cases. I think in terms of interaction, we both agree that the Rakdos card pool is much better than Mono Blue. With Mono Blue, you can act stack-based, Here, you have to wait and see what your opponent brings down. What I like about the Rakdos shell is actually that you can play cards like very, very powerful cards. Like I always say Goblin Bombardment when I want to say Broadside Bombardiers. Which is that's an incredible line, right? And I also had that recently when I played my friend's Breya deck, where you bring this down on turn 3 or something, turn 4 you attack with this goblin has menace, your opponent has 1 blocker, and all of a sudden you deal 12 damage in 1 turn and you win the game, because you can just throw this guy in or recycle him for 10 damage, which is crazy. I'm not too sure about the black interactions. Then again, here we have some access to tutor magic, which I like a lot. I could also see myself thinking about the Demonic Council, since due to artifacts and lands and stuff, it might be easier to enable a Delirium much earlier, since I would imagine this deck to fuel the graveyard, let's say, a bit faster than usually, depending on the artifacts you choose. But yeah, overall, I think it's an interesting comparison between this and the other card, but it definitely goes in the same direction. So you have a strong body, you should have relatively low costs, you have an immediate effect, and you have more effects than that. I personally like paying 4 mana is very expensive. Then again, since it deals damage to any target, can be very useful to deal with some nasty threats your opponent brings down, and in comparison to the mono blue deck, which if your opponent starts doing their things, you sometimes just sit there and watch. And if we have a look at the warrior again, I'm not too aware with the Ninja Turtles universe, to be honest, so I don't know what the creature type Utrom is, but who cares? If you have a look at that guy, by default, your commander does not allow you to play Ensnaring Bridge. Because
That's true. Yeah.
first, you draw a lot of cards. Because Ensnaring Bridge in Mono Blue is usually a way to stall the game until you find your way to win the game. And this guy draws you cards, which doesn't work with Bridge. And it's a very big guy, which also doesn't work with Bridge. So, yeah, it's a bit difficult. It has its problems, but so does Imskir, I would say.
Yeah, talking about both these cards, I'm quite curious to hear your opinion. I know that the rules committee seems to have a bit of an issue with cards that cheat command attacks. There's a justification for why like Tasigur and stuff is banned. Would you not say these cards kind of fall into that issue as well? Because Affinity for Artifacts can allow you to cheat command attacks if you have enough artifacts in play, is kind of where I'm getting at.
I think, to be honest, thinking of cheating commander attacks, like per se saying that cheating commander attacks is an issue, I think it's a bit outdated because it doesn't, in a way that it's my personal opinion, right? Not the opinion of the committee, but I think it doesn't make a difference if I give affinity to a card that would, or delve that would reduce the casting cost of this permanent if I do something for that in exchange, or I can just cross out the affinity and just make it a cheaper permanent. Because this guy could also just be a 4-drop, for example, right? Do you get my point? Like back then, when there were just a few CMC 1, 2, 3 command zones that were like super, super good, competing with all the other things, and Magic was slower overall, I think this argument was valid to say that we constantly have to check for that. These days, I'm not so sure anymore, to be honest. And yeah, I'm also thinking about, we have cards like Treasure Cruise, also banned, for example, for a similar reason, right? But also because the card is really good. Then again, back then you played, I would say, especially in the 30 HP meta game, 2 control decks against each other. In 50 minutes, you played 1 game at max, right? And you didn't have Cling to Dusts and all these different effects that would tackle your graveyard, so it was fairly easy to get the 7 cards in order to have like your second Ancestral Recall. Not quite, because it's sorcery speed, but yeah. I'm not sure if this argument is still valid as of today. But it has to be evaluated card by card, I would say. It could still be that the combination, maybe we totally underestimate this card, right? Maybe we have a look at it right now and we think, okay, it's cool. It doesn't seem to me that it's completely crazy, to be honest, but it seems solid. And maybe when you play it, it turns out, okay, maybe it's a bit too much, because you can play that consistently on turn 2, which requires you to put 6 artifacts onto the battlefield, which is quite a lot, right? You have to have the perfect hand for that, by the way, because 2 lands off of the 1 draw if you're on the play. But yeah, that's my stance on cost reduction and how dangerous it actually is.
Thank you very much for your opinion. It's a bit of a side tangent, but it is interesting talking to players like yourself who, obviously, having been around for so much longer, your take on the format is much more developed, I'd say. Because to me, a lot of things that I see or read can almost, it's like, why do they think this? Why do they think that? And be able to actually ask someone their opinion face to face is a nice way to understand a bit better.
I've just lived through all these legendaries and ban waves and whatsoever, It's
Amazing.
I was just here.
Well, I think we've spoken about quite a lot there overall. Is there anything else you wanted to add today? Anything else you wanted to discuss?
I guess not. No, I think if I think about, I think we covered quite a few things. I hope that even if we were jumping between this and that card. The rough concept of how to evaluate a commander came through. If not, maybe there is a part 2 required and we talk about the very basics. But maybe to sum it up, we can say check for power toughness, check for mana value, check for the effect, and what you can assemble with that. Very basic, right? Yeah, I could start talking about these flip-loving commanders, which I find very cool design-wise, but I think they will never make the cut for a serious command zone. Have you had a look into them?
I've read them all, and they've all kind of underwhelmed me. None of them really excited me very much.
I think
is there a particular one?
maybe Tristan.
So Tristan, which one's that one?
Tristan is a Gruul one. I will just link it to you.
Thank you.
I think this is the one that has maybe some potential because you can play Dog into this guy turn 2, and this seems to be a classical Hogak deck to me. You know, where you mill your Bloodghast, you mill your Hogak, you mill your Vengevine, things like this. That seems kind of interesting. And you have a 3/4 with Death Touch. You don't necessarily have to activate the flip that often. You also don't really have to do things with elves.
Yeah.
So I think this is the most interesting. Then again, talking about evaluating a commander, is the front side doing enough? Kinda yes, kinda no. It's a bit cute. You're just milling 3 cards. You don't get any value out of those 3 cards, and then you have a 3/4 Death Touch. But it supports a game plan that you can lean a bit into, right? Paying this 1 additional mana for the transformation, I think it's incredibly expensive from time to time. Like, even if you play Dogs and mana acceleration, you really have to have this in mind that it always steals you a little bit of tempo, and you really have to be able to afford that. Otherwise, you can't make it. I mean, then again, if you pay 1 mana, you get another flip. So it's basically paying 1 black for a Stitcher Supplier effect. And if you're in a very generous mood, you can exile one of your dogs and your opponent loses 2 lives. So you converted that into some kind of a Death Ray Shaman effect. But yeah, this is a card that I could think of being useful.
You've convinced me that it's definitely. The other ones, the Sig, the Goblin one. This one definitely screams out as having more potential than the others, but I'm still not. Still not completely sold.
I'm not trying to sell you this guy. I'm just saying, if you compare it to Ashling, for example, again, we have this transform ability, right? As all of those have. But here, ETB, you discard a card, you draw a card. 2 mana, 1/3. That's it. That's not enough. That's definitely not enough. I'm very sure we have cards in a format in Izzet color that do the same at a better cost efficacy ratio. So, and the backside is obviously a bit better, but still, it's not too crazy enough in order to waste 4 mana onto a 1/3, because you also have to keep in mind that if you decide to transform, the trigger goes on stack, your opponent can react, then you pay the mana, okay, then you have the second trigger, your opponent can still react to that and maybe kill the creature, and then you effectively paid 3 mana for this 1 trigger to happen, or the 2 triggers, but one of them is not really relevant, so the second one is the one that you wanted to go for. Not really worth it. But yeah, let's not lose ourselves in those new command zones, the transformation cards.
No, well,
the ones from Modern Horizons are actually much better, I would say.
I mean, I'm still thinking about Tristan. I'm looking at Tristan a bit more now, and I'm kind of thinking, I mean, like 1 mana to mill 3 cards, that isn't bad. If the quality of cards in graveyard get better, maybe it's a card that, again, we'll come back to in the future. But maybe milling 3 cards blind could become an even more powerful effect if we continue to get more like Hogak-esque cards being printed, which wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, I can say you can wait 1 more week. We have something up.
Okay, brilliant.
Waiting for the guys. Yeah. It's. I think it's a cool pile. I'm not sure if it would actually be able to compete in a serious metagame, but it's a fun pile for sure, and it's the best amongst the 3 that we choose. So we'll see.
Well, Felix, thank you so much for joining me. Everyone, again, if you haven't already seen Bitzelberg, if you somehow haven't already heard of Bitzelberg and you're playing Duel Commander, then what are you doing? What rock have you been living under? Go check out Bitzelberg. They're absolutely fantastic. And make sure to subscribe now.
Thank you very much.
Subscribe now so that in a week you won't miss the Tristan gameplay video coming out.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks very much for having me. All right. Have a good one, mate.